Elijah Thompson's tiny hand trembled as the sharp slap echoed through the cabin. His wide eyes blinked back tears, but they didn't fall. The moment was electric, frozen. And in that stillness, no one noticed the power he held, not until it was too late. Elijah, no more than 5, sat quietly in his first-class seat, the plush leather cushion cradling him as if this world of wealth and exclusivity were his by right. His mother, Danielle, sat beside him, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. Her face was calm, serene, almost as if she were unaware of the silent tension building in the air. But Elijah, his brown eyes scanning the cabin, felt something was off. The flight attendant, Jessica Lorne, had been circling their seats for a while, her gaze never quite landing on the pair. And when it did, it wasn't a friendly gaze. The look she gave Elijah could only be described as condescending, dismissive. She didn't know who they were, who he was. She didn't know he was the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. All she saw was a black child, sitting in a seat that, to her, seemed too grand for him. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached, her eyes narrowing in judgment. Without warning, she reached out and swatted Elijah's hand away from the tray table, as if his innocent gesture of exploring the space was an act of defiance. Elijah froze. His lips quivered, but the tears didn't come. It was the sting of disbelief, not pain. Danielle, watching from the corner of her eye, was already standing, her hands raised in protest. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded, but her voice was drowned out by the rush of whispers that began to spread through the cabin. Elijah's grip tightened on the armrest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how any of it was supposed to go. His father, David Thompson, wasn't just any man. He wasn't just a CEO. He was the CEO of Thompson Enterprises, a tech giant whose innovations were shaping the future of the industry. He had built an empire from nothing. He was a man with power, influence, and respect. And here, in this moment, his son was being humiliated by someone who had no idea what she had just done. The flight attendant, oblivious to the storm she was about to awaken, turned to Jessica with a sneer. "This is first class. You can't act like that." Elijah's lips parted, but instead of speaking, a voice, clear and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Do you know who my father is?" Elijah asked, his voice small but firm. Jessica paused. She wasn't expecting that. She laughed nervously, as though she were dismissing a child's simple attempt at getting attention. But Elijah wasn't just any child. "My father is David Thompson, CEO of Thompson Enterprises. This is my seat. You have no right to touch me." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. The room fell into an eerie silence. Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had no idea who this child was. She had no idea who she had just disrespected. Her gaze shifted from Elijah to Danielle, who stood there, proud, unwavering. The room that had once buzzed with hushed gossip and judgment suddenly went still, as every eye in the cabin turned toward the family. It was too late. The damage had been done. Jessica had crossed a line, and the repercussions would ripple far beyond this flight. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his small frame now standing taller than it ever had before. He wasn't just a black child. He wasn't just a nobody. He was David Thompson's son, and that, in this moment, was all that mattered. Jessica stood frozen in the aisle, the shock slowly creeping across her face as Elijah's words sank in. She had no idea who this child was, and the realization that she had just slapped the son of one of the most powerful men in the world was beginning to hit her. Her fingers trembled as she tried to steady herself, but the stares from the passengers were relentless. Danielle, standing next to Elijah, wasn't sure whether to feel proud of her son's boldness or to be worried about what would come next. But one thing was certain: Elijah had just turned the tables, and no one, especially Jessica, was ready for the fallout. As the seconds dragged on, the once silent cabin now buzzed with whispers. A few passengers shifted in their seats, some looking at Jessica with a mix of disdain, others in disbelief. A couple of them shot furtive glances at Elijah, still sitting upright, his small frame exuding an unspoken confidence. Danielle felt her heart race as she watched the scene unfold. She knew her husband's name was powerful, but she hadn't expected it to come to this. Not in front of strangers on a plane. Not in this way. Jessica was still trying to regain her composure. I, I'm sorry, I didn't know, she stammered, her voice now quivering, barely audible over the growing murmurs in the cabin. Elijah didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He wasn't a child anymore. Not in this moment. Not after what he had just said. Danielle placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder, giving him a nod of approval. You did the right thing, she whispered softly. Elijah gave a small nod in return, his focus still locked on Jessica. You should be sorry, Elijah said, his voice quiet but firm. No one should be treated like that. The words cut through the tension in the cabin like a blade. Jessica's face flushed red as she glanced around at the passengers. She felt small, exposed. She had misjudged this situation from the start. She had assumed that Elijah, the quiet, black child in first class, was just another passenger she could dismiss. But she was wrong. Elijah wasn't just any child. His father, David Thompson, was not just a businessman. He was a force in the corporate world, a man whose influence stretched across industries. And Elijah, his son, had the same quiet strength. The flight attendant took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. I'm really sorry, she repeated, her voice a little stronger now, though it still trembled. She knew she had no choice but to apologize, but the words felt hollow. It was too late to take back what she had done. As she turned to walk away, Danielle stood tall, her hand still on Elijah's shoulder. You've embarrassed him, Danielle said, her voice low, but unmistakably firm. And you've embarrassed yourself. You'll have to live with that. With that, she sat back down, her eyes softening as she glanced down at Elijah. Elijah, however, didn't seem bothered. He leaned back into his seat, his small hands folding together in his lap. The cabin was still, the murmurs fading as everyone tried to process what had just happened. For the rest of the flight, there was an unspoken understanding. No one dared speak out of turn, and Jessica, for the remainder of the journey, kept her distance from the Thompson family. The rest of the passengers had seen it, witnessed the quiet power of a child who, in the blink of an eye, had turned the tables on a flight attendant who never should have crossed the line. And as the plane soared through the skies, there was one thing everyone in that cabin knew. Elijah Thompson wasn't just the CEO's son. He was someone to be reckoned with. The plane touched down smoothly, the engines roaring as it came to a slow stop at the gate. The silence that had dominated the cabin for the past few hours was slowly breaking, the normal sounds of the flight beginning to return. But for Danielle and Elijah Thompson, the journey had already taken a turn they would never forget. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, passengers began to gather their belongings, their conversations returning to their normal hum. But the Thompsons stayed seated for a moment longer. Danielle looked at Elijah, a soft smile tugging at her lips. You did great, kiddo, she whispered. Elijah didn't reply at first, his gaze still fixed on the now empty first-class cabin. His small fingers traced the armrest, a slight frown still on his face. I wasn't scared, he said quietly, his voice barely a murmur. Danielle's heart swelled with pride. I know you weren't, she said. But you were brave. Elijah looked up at her then, his eyes steady, a glimmer of something new in them. It wasn't the same child who had walked on the plane hours ago. He had been transformed by something he didn't even fully understand yet. A few moments later, the passengers began to filter out, many of them glancing back at the Thompsons as they passed, some avoiding eye contact, others offering quick, nervous smiles. Danielle and Elijah stood up to leave, but before they could move, a voice stopped them. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson? A voice called from behind them. Danielle turned, recognizing the man standing there, a tall, sharp-dressed individual who seemed to be a part of the airline's staff. He had a respectful, but serious expression on his face. Yes, Danielle asked, her tone polite but wary. I'm sorry for the inconvenience earlier, he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elijah. I just wanted to apologize for the actions of our crew member. Danielle stiffened slightly, but before she could say anything, the man continued. We've already spoken to Jessica, and we've taken the necessary steps to ensure nothing like this happens again. I hope you understand. It was a misunderstanding. Danielle's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your apology, but that was more than a misunderstanding, she said calmly. That was a lack of respect. The man nodded, his face serious. Of course. And again, I apologize for the distress caused. He gave a slight bow, then added, We'll be more than happy to arrange a private escort for you and your son to the car if you wish. Danielle didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced down at Elijah, who was standing quietly beside her. The exchange had left a bitter taste in her mouth, but Elijah had already moved past it. "I'm fine," Elijah said quietly, looking up at the man with calm eyes. The man nodded, clearly not expecting the child's response. "Thank you, sir," Elijah added, his tone polite yet firm. The man was taken aback for a moment before he smiled. "Of course, young man. You're very welcome." As they left the plane, the airport terminal was a blur of people rushing to and fro. But Danielle couldn't help but notice how different she felt now. She had seen something in her son today, a strength that went beyond his years. Elijah was not just any child. He was David Thompson's son, and that, in itself, carried more weight than anyone could ever truly understand. As they made their way to the car, Danielle glanced down at Elijah again. His hand was now in hers, and his steps seemed lighter, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his small shoulders. "You know, kiddo," she said softly, "sometimes people don't know who they're dealing with." Elijah nodded, a small grin on his face. "Yeah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "But that's okay. They'll learn eventually." The next morning, Elijah woke up to the sound of his father's voice, calling him from downstairs. He stretched, rubbing his eyes as he heard David's footsteps moving across the hallway. The warmth of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Elijah's mind was still racing from the events of the previous day, but there was something else now, something different. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was a quiet certainty, a feeling that things had changed. As he made his way down the stairs, he saw his father standing by the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee in hand. David turned to look at him, his expression warm but serious. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Elijah nodded, his small feet carrying him toward the kitchen. He climbed onto one of the stools at the counter and looked at his father, who was watching him carefully. "Yeah," Elijah said after a moment, his voice stronger than it had been the day before. "I'm okay." David smiled, setting his coffee cup down. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his tone filled with quiet admiration. Elijah's heart swelled at the words, but he wasn't sure why. It wasn't the first time his father had said something like that, but it felt different today. There was a new understanding between them, something that hadn't been there before. The whole flight incident had shaken them both in unexpected ways. David hadn't anticipated that a simple trip would turn into such a defining moment, but it had. He had always known Elijah was smart, strong even, but seeing him stand up in the face of something like that had made him realize just how much his son had grown. "You know," David continued, his voice thoughtful, "sometimes people forget that we're all just people. They forget that everyone has their own strength, their own story." Elijah nodded again, taking in the words. His mind wandered back to the flight, to the look on Jessica's face when she realized who he was. The power of that moment still lingered, like an echo. "I think they thought I was just a kid," Elijah said quietly. "Like, just a regular kid who didn't belong." David's gaze softened, and he knelt down beside Elijah, looking him directly in the eyes. "You are not just a regular kid," he said firmly. "You are special, Elijah. And one day, people will understand that." Elijah felt his chest tighten with emotion, the weight of his father's words settling in his heart. He knew it wasn't just about the flight, or the apology, or even the people who had doubted him. It was about who he was, deep down, and how that would shape the future. That afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David took Elijah to the park. They sat together on a bench, watching the people around them as the world buzzed with its usual rhythm. But for Elijah, the world felt different now. It wasn't just about fitting in or proving anything to anyone. It was about owning who he was, and knowing that, no matter what, he had a place in this world. "You've got a lot to offer, son," David said, his voice filled with pride. "And don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't." Elijah looked at his father, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I won't," he replied, his voice steady and confident. And in that moment, Elijah knew that no matter where life took him, he would always have the strength to stand tall. A week had passed since the incident on the flight, and while the world outside seemed to return to its usual pace, things had shifted for Elijah in a way that he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just about the apology he received from the airline or the recognition of who he was. It was more than that. It was the feeling of knowing that, for once, his voice had been heard, his presence acknowledged. And it was something he carried with him every day since. One afternoon, as Elijah walked home from school, his mind drifted back to the conversation he had with his father. They had spoken about strength, about the power of standing up for what was right, and about never letting anyone define him. Elijah had taken those words to heart, feeling the weight of them in a way he hadn't before. He walked with his head held high, a quiet confidence in his steps. As he approached the park near their home, he saw a group of kids playing basketball. He recognized some of them from his class, but they hadn't spoken much before. As he neared the court, one of the boys, a tall kid named Ryan, called out to him, "Hey, Elijah, you want to join us for a game?" Ryan had always been the type to keep to himself, but there was something different in his tone today. Elijah hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't really played sports before, especially not with kids who had been a little distant in the past. But something inside him shifted. He thought back to the moment on the plane, when he stood up for himself without hesitation, and suddenly, he felt ready. "Sure," Elijah said, his voice steady. As he walked onto the court, the other kids watched him for a moment, their eyes curious but not unkind. They were sizing him up, just as people always did. But this time, Elijah didn't feel small. He didn't feel out of place. As the game began, Elijah found himself falling into the rhythm of the play, the ball feeling surprisingly natural in his hands. He wasn't the best player, but he wasn't the worst either. He moved with a sense of purpose, his focus sharp, his confidence growing with every pass and every shot. By the end of the game, the score didn't matter. What mattered was how the others looked at him now. Ryan gave him a nod of approval as the game finished, his eyes no longer filled with the usual judgment, but something else, respect. "You did good, Elijah," Ryan said with a grin. "You've got some skills." Elijah smiled back, a sense of pride filling his chest. He had done something he hadn't thought possible a week ago. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, faced his doubts, and found his place among these kids. As the sun set over the park, casting long shadows across the court, Elijah stood there, feeling different. He had never been the kid who stood out, but now, he felt like he had finally found his voice. He wasn't just David Thompson's son anymore. He was Elijah, someone who could stand on his own and hold his ground. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The following week, Elijah found himself facing an unexpected challenge. It was a bright Thursday afternoon, and he was in his classroom, the hum of conversation and the shuffle of papers filling the air. As the bell rang, signaling the start of class, he took his usual seat by the window. The sun streamed in, casting a warm glow on the desk. Elijah felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling of belonging that had become more familiar lately. He had found his place, both at school and in the world. As the teacher, Mrs. Green, began to write today's lesson on the board, Elijah noticed a pair of eyes lingering on him. It was Ryan, the same kid from the park. Elijah hadn't expected to see him here, but Ryan's gaze didn't seem like the curious one from before. This time, it felt different. Before Elijah could look away, Ryan leaned over and whispered, "Hey, you're pretty cool. I didn't expect that, you know? You really held your own last week." Elijah turned toward him, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft but steady. "It was fun." Ryan nodded, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something more than just acknowledgement. "I heard some of the guys talking about you after the game," Ryan continued, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "They said you were smart. I didn't know you were that good at basketball, too." Elijah felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He hadn't expected to become the subject of conversation among the kids at school. The thought of being noticed, really noticed, made him a little uneasy. But he didn't let it show. "I'm just trying to fit in," Elijah said, his tone casual. But inside, he was trying to process what Ryan's words meant. The shift in how he was seen was subtle, but it was there. Just a few days ago, he was the quiet kid who kept to himself, the one who didn't stand out. Now, things were different. As the day went on, Elijah noticed more than just Ryan looking at him. There were glances, quiet whispers, and some smiles that seemed to acknowledge his presence in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about being the son of David Thompson anymore. It was about something deeper, something that came from within him. Elijah had found a way to stand out, not through his last name or who his father was, but through his own actions and how he carried himself. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Elijah was ready to head home. But as he packed up his things, Mrs. Green approached his desk. "Elijah," she said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to let you know that I've noticed a change in you. You've been more confident lately, more engaged in class. I'm proud of you." Elijah felt a surge of pride at her words, but he didn't let it show too much. He simply nodded, smiling back at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," he said, his voice steady. As he walked out of the classroom and into the hallways, he felt something new. It wasn't just the respect of his peers or his teachers. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing who he was and not needing to prove it to anyone. Elijah wasn't just a name. He wasn't just the son of David Thompson. He was Elijah, and that, for the first time, felt like enough. A few weeks passed, and Elijah began to settle into a routine that felt more natural than ever. School was no longer a place of quiet observation. It had become a place where he could engage, be himself, and step up when needed. The whispers that once followed him were now replaced by nods of approval, some even asking him for help with assignments or to join in on activities. Elijah didn't mind. In fact, he found that he liked being seen for who he was, not just for his last name. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, Elijah noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the park. It was Ryan, his classmate from the basketball game, and he was looking up at the sky, his legs stretched out in front of him. Elijah hesitated for a moment, but decided to walk over. "Hey," Elijah said casually, stopping in front of the bench. Ryan looked up, a small grin forming on his face. "Hey man, how's it going?" Elijah sat down next to him, not quite sure why he felt so comfortable around Ryan now. The two had barely spoken before the basketball game, but everything had shifted since then. "It's good," Elijah replied. "School's been okay, and, everything else." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly seeing through Elijah's casual tone. "Yeah, I know what you mean," Ryan said, shifting his position so that he was facing Elijah. "You've been different lately. More confident, I guess." Elijah smiled softly. "I think I've just been figuring things out, It's like, I've always been quiet, but now I feel like I don't need to hide anymore." Ryan nodded slowly, as if taking in Elijah's words. "I get it. I've been thinking a lot about that too. I've been kind of, not really myself, trying to fit in with the wrong crowd." Elijah turned to face him fully, intrigued by Ryan's openness. "What do you mean?" "Well," Ryan began, his voice a little hesitant, "I've been hanging out with some guys who just aren't really good for me. They've been pressuring me to do things I'm not proud of, just to feel like I belong." Elijah listened carefully, understanding more than Ryan probably realized. "I used to feel that way too," Elijah said, his voice calm. "Like, I had to be something I'm not just to fit in. But you don't have to do that. You just have to be yourself." Ryan looked at him, his expression shifting to one of thoughtfulness. "Yeah, maybe you're right," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think I've been hiding behind them, trying to make up for things I'm not proud of. But I can't keep doing that." Elijah nodded, feeling a sense of quiet pride in the way Ryan was opening up. "It's not easy, but it's worth it," Elijah said. "It's better to stand on your own than to hide behind someone else's expectations." For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sky above was a deepening blue, the sun beginning to set on another day. Finally, Ryan spoke again, his voice firm. "Thanks, Elijah. You've got a good head on your shoulders." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "No problem," he replied. "We all need to figure it out sooner or later." As the evening air grew cooler, they both stood up from the bench. Elijah felt lighter, like the weight of the world had shifted just a little bit. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an outsider anymore. He felt like he belonged, not because of who his father was or what people expected of him, but because he had finally accepted who he was. And that was enough. As the weeks went on, Elijah's life seemed to settle into a rhythm. He was no longer the quiet, overlooked kid he once was. He had begun to carve out his place in school, his voice becoming stronger, his presence undeniable. It wasn't just the basketball game or the way he stood up for himself anymore. It was the way people started to look at him differently. It was the way he felt, deep down, that he could handle whatever came his way. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the school library, he noticed a familiar face approach him. It was Jessica, the flight attendant who had apologized after the incident on the plane. Elijah had seen her once or twice since, but he hadn't expected to cross paths with her here, of all places. She hesitated for a moment as she stood by the table, her eyes searching for his. "Elijah, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice soft. Elijah looked up from his book, surprised. He hadn't thought about that day in a while, but it was still fresh in his mind. "Sure," he said, his voice steady. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, taking a seat across from him. "I just wanted to say thank you again," Jessica began, her hands nervously folding in her lap. "I know I can never take back what happened, but I wanted you to know how much that moment changed me." Elijah listened quietly, not sure where the conversation was going, but intrigued. "It wasn't just about the apology," she continued, her eyes meeting his. "It was about realizing how quick I was to judge you, how I let assumptions dictate my actions. I've been thinking a lot about it since then, and it really opened my eyes." Elijah raised an eyebrow, not sure what to say. He hadn't expected such a heartfelt confession from her. "I guess what I'm trying to say is that I was wrong," she said, her voice steady now. "And I want to make it right, even if it's just in the smallest way." Elijah thought for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been holding on to a bit of anger toward her, but hearing her speak so openly made him reconsider. "I get it," he said finally. "People make mistakes. What matters is what they do after." Jessica smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm glad you understand." For a few moments, they sat in silence, neither knowing exactly what to say next. But Elijah didn't mind. The conversation had shifted something in him. He realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go of the anger that weighed you down. And that was something he was learning to do, piece by piece. As they stood to leave, Jessica gave him one last look, her expression sincere. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right," she said. Elijah gave her a small smile. "It's all good," he replied, his voice calm. "Just remember to see people for who they really are, not just what you think they are." She nodded, her face softening. "I will. Take care, Elijah." As Jessica walked away, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just about making things right with her. It was about the growth he had gone through in the past few weeks, about understanding that people weren't defined by their mistakes, but by what they did afterward. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah realized he had learned the same lesson himself. He wasn't just a kid trying to fit in anymore. He was someone who could stand tall, no matter the situation. As time passed, Elijah found himself growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about how others saw him anymore. It was about how he saw himself. Every day, he felt more confident, more assured in his own skin. He no longer felt the need to shrink back or apologize for who he was. The weight that had once hung over him had lifted, and he could breathe easier. One Saturday afternoon, Elijah and his father, David, were at the park, a place they had started to visit more often. They had been spending more time together lately, going for walks, playing basketball, or simply talking. It was something Elijah had come to appreciate, especially now that he had a deeper understanding of the importance of family. They sat on a bench, watching the kids play in the distance, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the air. "You know, Dad," Elijah began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think I get it now. About standing up for yourself." David turned to look at him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Oh, what do you mean?" Elijah took a deep breath, his gaze focused on the kids across the park. "I used to think I had to be someone else, to fit in. But now, I know that I don't have to be anyone else. I just have to be me." David's eyes softened as he watched his son, pride swelling in his chest. "That's the most important lesson you can learn," he said quietly. "Being yourself is always enough." Elijah smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him at his father's words. He had always known that his dad was a strong, influential man, but now he saw him in a new light. His dad wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a father who had taught him how to stand tall, how to find his own voice, and how to be unapologetically himself. "Thanks, Dad," Elijah said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." David reached over, giving Elijah a light pat on the back. "You've earned it, son. You've always had the strength inside you. You just had to see it." They sat there for a while, the world around them moving on, but in that moment, nothing felt more important than the two of them together. Elijah had learned that the world didn't always see him the way he wanted to be seen, but that was okay. What mattered was how he saw himself. And with his father by his side, he knew that he had the support and the strength to keep growing, to keep learning, and to never stop believing in himself. As they got up to leave, David placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You're ready for anything," he said, his voice firm but filled with love. Elijah looked up at his father, a feeling of peace settling over him. "I think I am," he replied. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt truly ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He just had to be Elijah.